Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're talking about your paper format, and specifically today's discussion is on thesis statements. Every paper that you do for me will have an introduction and will have a conclusion. The reason I have you do that is so that you create a consistency of structure and also separate the preamble from the meat and potatoes of your paper, which really is the middle paragraph. To that end, every introduction is going to have a thesis statement, and that thesis statement has some very specific elements to it that I want you to follow in order to create college-level work that clarifies where you're going. To that end, there are a couple things that I want you to keep in mind. A thesis statement is the primary point of your overall paper. It is not a laundry list of the specific points that you're going to make, and this becomes especially important when you move beyond 3 points that you're going to make, like in a test or a relatively short paper, and you move into a paper that's 10, 15, 20 pages long, and you don't have the room, nor is it practical, to list all the points you're going to make. Certainly, when you were writing thesis statements in more basic skills work, they have you give a list of your points that you're going to make, simply because they want you to remember those points, to cover those points in the body of the essay. But at this level, we're moving beyond that, and what we're really looking for are 4 basic elements within the thesis statement that I'm looking for. The first, you need to identify the work by title. Secondly, you should identify the author's name specifically and completely. And thirdly, you need to identify the literary device or devices that you will apply. If you're doing an English 101 class, the literary devices are going to be things like symbolism, irony, conflict. For your first paper, your thesis statement will indicate whether the work is more interpretive or more escapist, more literary or more commercial, because that's the overall point of your paper. You will not include, for example, discussions about whether a specific character is round or flat, because that's not the overall point. That's a sub-point that brings us to this overall point. For anything above 101, for English 103, 213, 293, etc., really what you're doing is analysis from the perspective of critical perspectives. However, for all intents and purposes also, I don't want you to list the critical perspectives, and I really do not want you to list them and tell me what they're going to reveal, because that's what your body paragraphs are for. I would rather you simply say something along the lines of, from various critical perspectives, and then give me the fourth part, which is a theme. A theme supports everything. It draws everything together and makes it logical. In terms of your thesis statement, if you're doing analysis of a poem and using 4 or 5 different critical perspectives, what should gather it together, which would make the whole paper cohesive, is to find something that the song is about, no matter what critical perspective you apply. And so you might say something along the lines of, when analyzing Dear Mama by Tupac Shakur, using various critical perspectives, the work is a clear indication as to the value and power of women in a society in relation to their sons. And that means if you cover this from a African-American cultural perspective, or you did this from a biographical perspective, or from an historical perspective, or even from a cultural perspective that is outside the African-American community, the thing that they can't get around is that the lines of the song essentially talk about this person's relationship with his mother, and therefore would be reflected back in whatever critical perspective you chose. Identifying your thesis in a way tells me where your paper is going, and it sets the tone for the rest of the paper. To that end, the thesis statement should be at the end of the introductory paragraph. As indicated in my discussion of organization and outlines, the first part of that paragraph will be the background statement, some kind of historical or some information like that that gets us started. But that thesis statement is the last thing you give me in the introduction, and then the next paragraph will be you getting into the individual body paragraphs that either discuss how a story is interpretive or escapist for 101, or how symbolism is used in English 101, or the critical perspectives that you're going to apply in English 103. A couple of things to keep in mind. A thesis statement is not an intent statement. Don't say things like, in the following paper I will, or the following paper will discuss. I know you're writing a paper, I'm reading it. Instead, simply just make a declarative statement. Through these critical perspectives, this work means this. Or through the use of symbolism and irony, this author is telling us this. In a way, in a very direct way, in which you're not cluing me into the fact that you're writing a paper. Secondly, you don't want to ask a question. A thesis statement is not a question. It answers the question in a general way. Also, it is not vague. Try to avoid the so generalized point, something along the lines of, through various critical analysis, this work talks about love. Positively, negatively, anything. It's too vague. Instead, find something a little bit more narrowly defined that really does describe the point of the essay that you're making. Be brief, be concise. Remember that all the detail is going to be in the body paragraphs anyway. Make sure that you do identify the author and the title, and ultimately the literary devices or the literary approaches that you're going to be using. There are some examples on my website. Certainly in the organization and outlines discussion, there are examples of thesis statements on every single one of the 12 introductory paragraphs I give you as examples. Likewise, on my discussion of thesis statements, there are a couple of examples of thesis statements at the bottom of that particular page, all concerning the same story. And the idea is that your thesis statement will tell us where you're going, but not give us a list of all the things you're going to say. Keep those things in mind as you write your papers, and remember that there will be a thesis statement for every essay that you do for me. Stay in touch.